Alright, this video doesn't need an introduction. You already know what time it is. Banlist format. We're pumping out these videos. Keep in mind, guys, before the video starts, that I want to let you guys know that this ban list is just after about a day of me speculating, talking with some of my groups, and then eventually just testing out. I barely tested out any of these decks, by the way. I've only tested pretty much the Snake Eye stuff and like the branded stuff. So I can't really speak too much about this. Just a disclaimer, because every time I make one of these, people are like, well, what about this deck? I'm like, relax, okay? If your deck is missing, comment down below, and obviously we will make a more updated version once events start rolling out, like, you know, YCS Raleigh, and when 10 Pie Dragons release, we'll definitely be updating that as well. But this is just an initial release at first. Obviously, I'll go over every single card, and if you guys don't want to do that, skip to the end as always. But I'm gonna give an explanation for pretty much all of these, so let's go ahead and get started. So the first one is Voiceless Voice. Definitely an A-tier deck, didn't get touched at all. Pretty solid deck. Definitely can't be the best deck though, but it'll always be solid. I feel like this deck is like the new Alistair, the Invoker deck that was, you know, played pretty much all throughout like 2018, 17, and 19. And this is pretty much one of those sticky decks. So I'll always be good into a brand new, we don't know what's going on type of format. Very safe pick to play. So definitely an A-tier deck, but it could never be the best deck, I think, but it's a very solid deck. Vanadium, B tier. I don't really think it's that low, but depending on how many people decide to play hand traps and stuff like that, because, you know, calamities is still legal and you still can do this shit in this deck. And, you know, I feel like a lot of people now might be starting to play board breakers due to the fact that, you know, anti-spell went to 1, so, you know, your board breakers have a very high chance of actually working now. So maybe something to consider if you're playing if you're thinking of like a budget deck or something like that. I think Vanadium is pretty solid. Dragon Link, C tier. Abyssials are in the game. Tierlist, I think, is still going to be C tier. Doesn't really matter. This balance doesn't really actually do anything to make tier good or worse, but it's a solid deck, pretty fun to play. Hot take. This is going to be a hot take one. I think Branded is going to be S tier. I think it actually hangs. My bad. Hangs in there with the Snake Eyes deck. I actually think this deck is really good. It only gets held back by, I think, anti-spell really, and honestly any form of and like the best thing against the branded deck was literally Baron Savage, because that's like how you like stop this deck. You need to negate their powerful spell cards like Fusion Deployment, Branded Fusion, Branded High Spirits. But yeah, those cards out the window. So how, like the Fire King stuff is just gonna get bodied by this deck. And I think the pure Snake Eyes deck, if you're ending on Appaloosa IP, I'm sorry, but get the fuck out of here, because all your cards are getting chain blocked. The Appaloosa ain't doing shit. 1 SP isn't gonna get you there. So I actually think, really hot take, this deck did not get hit at all. Absolutely crazy. So I actually think this deck is either on the same tier as the fire decks, like the Snake Eyes deck, or even better. I don't think it's worse, by the way. So I actually think this deck is pretty solid, also pretty cheap as well. Could be a hot take, but let me know what you guys think about that. Kashtira didn't get touched at all, but a solid shifter deck still. So B tier does have consistency issues, but I mean, it's still a solid pick, I think, in the start of a new format. Labyrinth, I think, is pretty bad still. Doesn't really, the balance didn't really help it. I mean, banning Baron Savage is pretty good for the deck, but I do think the Fire King stuff just like kind of bodied this deck, because Kieran is too broken, and then Fire King is probably the most speculated like played deck, right? So I think Labyrinth, it's not really its time right now. Unchained, garbage, didn't really do anything. Sprite, pretty much garbage. Purely, this one I actually want to give to A tier. This deck didn't get hit at all, and it also went from Delicious Memory went from 1 to 2, and I also think this deck has a lot of good matchups actually, and also it can play a bunch of cards like the DeFi cards, which didn't even get hit on the list, that works very well into this deck. As good matchups, good floodgates that didn't get hit on the list. Rivalry is still very good, you can still play that, and it's a very solid deck actually. People sleep on this deck, but I think this deck is very good. And also Stray Street is just still like awesome, and like now you don't have to deal with Omni Negates, and this deck is the best deck at cracking boards. This deck is probably the only deck that I think that can go second and draw like one non-engine card and actually crack your board, because like the way you play with like Happy and like My Friend, adding back 3 cards, it's actually pretty good. So I wouldn't sleep on this deck. I actually think this deck is very, very solid. I say that all the time, but I actually mean that. Salad, D tier is garbage. Raisin, if you don't draw shifter, then maybe like A tier. If it doesn't draw shifter, D tier. Rika, I have no stance on this deck. I don't know anything about it. I assume it's not good, so I'm putting it at C. Infernoble, Isol's banned, but it's kind of funny. I'll probably give it C tier. I mean, if you're gonna play a combo deck, just play like Fire or something. It's a better combo deck than any Infernoble Fire deck. And even if you're playing Infernoble, you still have to play like wanted cards. So if you're playing wanted cards anyway, you might as well just play Snake Eye cards. So like, yep, C tier. Rescue Ace, pretty decent still. I think I'll put it around like B. Nothing changed about this deck, but I still think the Snake Eyes deck are a little bit better, so I'd definitely give it a B tier. Pure Snake Eyes, definitely S tier. So even though Jet got hit, I still think there's ways that you can still play this deck, whether that's with the Kashtira cards that people have been hyping around, or that's just using no Jet at all, which we've seen success in the past with like Paulo, Gabriel Nets topping YCS Vegas, playing no Jet Synchro at all, just playing completely all hand traps, and then ending on Appaloosa and IP and backed up by a lot of hand traps. And you know, maybe you can change the deck to play more non-engine, maybe something to beat Branded, for example, like more Bestials into the main deck and things like that, to make it yourself have a better matchup. But I do think this deck is still a solid deck, so I wouldn't sleep on this deck either. Pure Snake Eyes is still, like, I think a very high top contender. Chimera, yeah, just play Branded. Fire King, same thing around here, S tier. I do think Fire King and Pure Snake Eyes, I would say Fire King is a little bit better than Pure Snake Eyes because of the jet hits. Yeah, I do think these are all on the same tier right now, Branded, Fire King, and Pure. So yeah, Fire King slightly a bit better because I do think that it basically just didn't get hit. That's not a Link Rebo, which is huge, but you know, it's less than Baron and Savage, right? So definitely something to consider there if you're playing a Snake Eyes deck. Play the Fire King stuff. Math Mech, don't play that, please. Centurion, I think, is actually pretty decent. Obviously, like I said earlier, Calamities didn't get hit, so like I wouldn't hate playing this deck. It does have consistency issues, and it can't really play like strong tech cards. Like it can't play Shifter, for example. I mean, I guess it can, but like it can't. So yeah, I would say it's a B tier deck. Runic decks, I actually think didn't get touched at all. Like Runic Stun, for example, was actually pretty good. So I'm hovering between A and B tier. I'll probably just give it A tier out of like just me not having that much knowledge about it. And the reason why I'm giving it A tier is because this deck, the floodgates in this deck didn't actually get hit, right? The Runic Stun deck does not play Summon Limit, and it doesn't play Anti-Spell. They play Synchro Zone and Skill Drain, which aren't on the list. And shoutouts to Synchro Zone, because Synchro Zone's worst enemies, Baron and Savage, are in jail. So like this deck just got buffed indirectly, by the way. And also, there's very cool ways to play around Skill Drain with Link Rebo. Guess what? It's banned. So like this deck indirectly actually got buffed, which is freaking troll because I hate playing against this. But yeah, you have no way to dodge Skill Drain anymore. So good job. Better draw your Cosmics. Flaunder definitely I actually give this deck around like a B tier. I actually want to give this A tier, but this might be reaching. But it's a very solid pick overall. I mean, the only thing holding this shit back is bricking. Last thing, Tenpai. I haven't tested enough Tenpai, but I definitely think at first release it'll be A tier. It is kind of like a gimmick strategy. That's why I'm giving it a high A tier. I don't think it could compete with Snake Eyes and Branded yet, but there's definitely builds later on in the future that could probably change that, right? So I don't really know. I'll definitely have to dissect more into Tenpai and see more of the updated builds. But that's gonna be it for this one, guys. If you guys made it this far and watched the entire video, don't forget to leave a like, comment, and a sub, and I'll catch y'all tomorrow with some brand new format discussions. And peace.